right, there we go. So, why transitions research? That obviously has a lot to do with sustainable development and sustainability becoming a topic of concern, and realizing that sustainability problems are classic sort of examples of sort of wicked problems, persistent, contested, and so forth. And the emergence of these sustainability problems in sectors such as energy, transport, water, and food turn the attention of scholars from various scientific communities to the ways in which society could combine economic and social development with a reduction of its pressure on the environment. This is what the SDRN website says about why transitions research is needed. And I think what it really emphasizes here is various scientific communities, so the interdisciplinarity in sustainability transition research. But there's also an interesting, I think, undertone about which sort of follows the tradition of ecological modernization, in the sense that care for environment and sustainability thinking is combined with social and economic development. And in that sense, sort of subscribes to the optimistic view of sustainable development, that environmental care, social care, and economic care can be combined. What is sort of new that sustainability transition research brought to the table is that it really advocates radical disruptive change, arguing that incremental changes in prevailing systems won't suffice, and there's a need for transformative change at the systems level, which stretches across systems of both production and consumption. So definition of sustainability transition is very multi. It's multidimensional, it's multi-actor, it's multidisciplinary, it's long-term. So in that sense, it's a very open and sort of liberal understanding of sustainability transitions. There's a lot that you can put into sustainability transition, and that has also been, we'll come back to that in the discussion, this has also been raised in some of the questions that you submitted. Another sort of key element of sustainability transitions is really that sort of systemic perspective. Therefore, it's really important to keep in mind that sustainability transitions are about socio-technical systems. And sort of if you take the full word, it would be sustainable socio-technical system transitions. So what is then a socio-technical system? That's a system that consists of networks of actors, individuals, firms, and other organizations, but often sort of really understood as collective actors, actor groups, rather than individual actors. Institutions, the societal and technical norms, regulations, standards of good practice, as well as the material artifacts and knowledge that interact and together provide specific services for systems. So, in a nutshell, it's about actors, institutions, and technology. And then sort of the system is defined by the societal function it performs. So providing energy, providing housing, providing food, etc., etc. And that is, I think, important to keep in mind, because in that sense, it is somewhat different from, say, other systems understandings in innovation studies, like the innovation systems perspective. It does not have that specific sort of societal function system perspective. So here's just an example from the work of Frank Geels, how a socio-technical system for transportation looks like. And it shows you that it includes many different sort of things and phenomena, ranging from the way that the automobile industry is structured in terms of its production chains, as well as its sort of maintenance and distribution networks, as well as I said earlier, the institutions, the regulations and policies that are in place, traffic rules, parking fees, emission standards, car taxes, but also sort of soft institutions like culture, symbolic meaning, how automobility is connected to a sense of freedom and individuality, but also hard networks or hard sort of infrastructures like a fuel infrastructure. Now, what I, in this sort of nutshell of sustainability transitions, really wanted to get at is this figure from the paper by Jochen Marquardt, Bernard Schaffer, and Rob Raven from 2012, which shows a bit of a sort of a history of thought of sustainability transitions. And I think it's fair to say that the multi-level perspective is probably sort of the most significant or the most sort of most central framework in transitions research. At least it's the one that is most cited and the one that is maybe most well known. And this concept goes back to actually an early publication from 1998 by Arie Rip and René Kemp, but which was subsequently sort of popularized and further developed and elaborated through the work of Frank Geels that probably most of you are very familiar with. But I think it's important also here to sort of see that, to realize that at that time, sort of the theorization of the multi-level perspective was very much influenced by work on technology assessment, and particularly constructive technology assessment at that time. That's, for example, work that Arie Rip was very much engaged with. Evolutionary economics and innovation studies, going back to 1977, the seminal work of Nelson and Winter, as well as the work of Giovanni Dozzi in 1992. But was also very much influenced by, say, constructivist perspectives on technology, social shaping of technology, the Scott model of Wiebe Bijker from 1987, or the large technological systems from Hughes from 1987. What isn't sort of captured so much in this picture is also how multi-level perspective very much sort of draws on institutional theory. Maybe in slightly later work where Frank Geels kind of basically drew on the three pillars of Scott to do institutional analysis, being sort of the regulative, the normative, and the cognitive institutional pillars. So there you got it. It's already very multidisciplinary. The MLP model already kind of draws on economics, sociology, and I think this is very characteristic for many sort of theorizations and theories in transition studies. What is really the strength of the MLP model is that it accounts both for novelty creation and innovation, but also for resistance and inertia and path dependency. And at least when I started reading this literature, I found it really, really refreshing. When I was doing my own PhD, a lot of the work on innovation systems suffered, if you like, a bit from innovationism, assuming that all innovation is good, but also primarily looking at the drivers of innovation, rather than really having a lot of interest or analytical understanding for what explains resistance against innovation. So in that sense, that was, I think, at that time really a major contribution of the MLP model. It was also not just sort of, even though it became really well known for its theory, it was very empirically grounded also, and I think that was a lot, attributed to the work of Frank Geels, who applied the MLP model and sort of developed it further by doing historical analysis of socio-technical change, socio-technical transformations. For example, from sailing ships to steamships, or from horse and carriage to automobility. Right. So we ended up with the multi-level perspective of regime, niche, and landscapes, and I don't think I should go too much into further detail about that, assuming you're quite familiar. But I think another important sort of conceptual pillar in transitions research is the strategic niche management concept, which, if you like, is also a governance approach to transitions and sort of follows from the multi-level perspective. It is really about, how can you foster niches so that they become sufficiently matured so they can challenge a incumbent regime. And it typically advocates that to do that around sort of emergent innovations, you need to build heterogeneous networks of actors that transcend the typical user-producer sort of divide, and also include potential non-users or actors that would have resistance against the technology. It puts emphasis on the expectations that actors have about an innovation, and how those expectations are articulated and how they may shape the future sort of development of an innovation. And it emphasizes not just sort of technical learning, but also what is called in this literature Mode 2 learning about norms and values, institutional learning. Another way to call it is double loop learning. Now, the strategic niche management literature or concept has a lot of similarities also with the sort of the third big pillar in transitions research, transition management. But you could say that transition management actually much more sort of branched out into also other theoretical fields of research and empirical fields of research. It still sort of draws heavily on the three levels of MLP, niche, regime, and landscape, but it has much more also sort of brought in other literatures, particularly literatures related to governance. And you could say this substream is the literature that is most, or the community that is most engaged with doing action research. This is not just about doing analysis of transitions, but really also influencing that those transitions are further sped up, or in the case of, say, unsustainable transitions, that the regime gets further destabilized. And one of their main proponents there, Jan Rotmans, doesn't even call himself anymore an academic, but he calls himself a scientific activist, right? And then, as a fourth important concept pillar in transitions research, we've got the technological innovation systems, which has a much clearer sort of lineage back to the tradition of innovation systems research back in the 80s, and which actually was sort of not even developed under the umbrella of transitions research back in early 90s. People like Stankiewicz, Bo Carlson were doing research within the sort of traditional innovation systems tradition on the emergence of new industries and new technologies, which had not much to do with sustainability. But basically that sort of literature was revisited and got a revival in the 2000s when scholars in Gothenburg, particularly Anna Bergek, Staffan Jakobsson, and in Utrecht, Marco Heckert, sort of applied the technological innovation system approach to understand the development and the fusion of sustainable technologies, and kind of very famously developed the functional approach to innovation systems, criticizing traditional innovation systems research for being too much concerned with structures as such. Right. I'm not sure whether I get the chat function up. I'm not sure whether there are any questions. I don't when I'm in my shared screen. Let's see. There we go. Is there anyone that has a quick question of clarification so far? If it's more a discussion point, we'll take that at the discussion later on. No. All right, then we continue. The scientific activist, that is Jan Rotmans. All right, now we go back to full screen. So now that you have, keep that picture in mind. Yes, Christian, what would you like to ask?
Hi, sorry, before I miss the chance, we can take it afterwards also if you think it's more appropriate, but I was wondering, there seems to be a lot of interchange across concepts between socio-technical systems that you briefly showed us and the socio-technical regime. And I was wondering if there's like a clear-cut differentiation between the understanding that we might have of a socio-technical system and also a socio-technical regime. What are the differences, what are the commonalities, and the relationship between both?
So there's a hierarchy there, and you could say the socio-technical regime is included in the socio-technical system. And at least in the early work of Frank Gales, he defined it really as sort of the rules that enable and constrain a socio-technical system. So it really refers to the institutional dimension of a socio-technical system. Having said that, that's like, at least for me, the way I also try to make that distinction, though I think in subsequent literatures and studies, regime and socio-technical system got also increasingly conflated. And I still think, there's quite a lot of confusion in studies about, what is really a socio-technical regime, and, what is the unit of analysis there. And people, for example, in transition management, talk about the regime as a set of actors. So that is, there's not a clear-cut answer there, and there's quite some confusion also in the literature, I think. Okay. All right, then a brief history of transition studies with its origins in the Netherlands. So I got actually a bit of inspired to make this reflection when I saw a figure, which is here on the right, in a relatively recent OECD report on system innovation. And this OECD report is, in a sense, quite important because it sort of shows how transition thinking and transition theory is increasingly becoming also legitimized in rather mainstream policy arenas. Because if the OECD starts to talk about sustainability transitions and system innovation, means that it gets increasing sort of acceptance amongst policymakers. And we've seen that, for example, happen with the innovation systems approach, and how Bengt Åke Lundvall was really important in mainstreaming this approach through his engagement with the OECD. Enough about that, but when I saw this figure in the OECD report, it really reminded me of a figure I saw about 25 years ago in a policy report that I was working on at that time as a master's student in the Dutch policy program DTO, which stands for Duurzame Technologieontwikkeling, translated to English as Sustainable Technology Development, which ran from 1993 to 1997, and which was a collaboration of different ministries, 5 different ministries in the Netherlands, and which was all about thinking what technologies and innovations are needed to achieve sustainable development, and very much sort of also emphasized system transformation, realizing that sort of the efficiency gains of optimal use of technology or just improving piecemeal would not sort of cut the cake. And that sort of got me to revisit my master's thesis back in the 90s, which is all written in Dutch, unfortunately, so I can't really share it unless I can share it, but you need to know Dutch to read it. But it has a lot of striking similarities with transition thinking. So it emphasizes a paradigm shift in technological development. So at that time, there were projects running about novel protein foods, how to substitute meat. This was obviously a lot about, low carbon energies, but it was also about, car sharing, e-mobility. It had sort of a lot of sort of avant-garde thinking around, what are sort of the technological futures if we really want to achieve sustainable development. It was heavy on technology, but it did sort of acknowledge that technology alone would not be enough, but emphasized how technology co-evolved with structure and culture in society. So you also had there sort of already an embryonic understanding of a socio-technical sort of system. It emphasized path dependency, entrenchment, and stability. This is sort of the similar things that we see when we think about regimes in transitions, and how technology is shaped by actors and networks. So the Scott approach. Scott of Wiebe Bijker. And then what it did was basically say, well, we can't just model through with our existing systems, technologies, etc. But back in early 90s, this policy program really sort of advocated that together with multiple stakeholders, you need to develop long-term future visions about sustainability. And then through an exercise of backcasting, arrive at what you need to do in the short terms in terms of socio-technical experimentation. So if we envision that, we want to have a meat-free future, and we want to develop novel protein foods, how does sort of the technology pathway look like to arrive in that meat-free future by 2040? And what would be sort of the innovation and the experimentation projects we need to do in the short run? So I think, this, even though this was early 1990s, sounds very, very familiar to still a lot of the literature that we see in sustainability transitions. And this DTO program, which I should really sort of acknowledge there, the work of Leo Jansen, who unfortunately has passed away, but also people like Philip Vergracht, who from the literature. This sort of program then morphed into the KSI initiative, or the KSI network, the Knowledge Network for System Innovations and Transitions, which ran from 2004 to 2010, which involved 10 Dutch universities and the Applied Research Institute, TNO, and which was funded, interestingly, by revenues from natural gas. So there's some interesting similarities there, perhaps with Norway. And at its onset, it involved approximately 80 researchers, much more sort of became part of it as it grew. And again, it was inherently interdisciplinary. It really cut across economics, sociology, history, engineering, cultural studies. It consists of three main pillars: sort of historical research, and that's where a lot of the papers from Frank Keels came from, doing sort of the historical socio-technical regime shift analysis. Then looking really at much more innovations in the present and how those transitions should be governed and monitored, that sort of transition management aspect. And then thirdly, there was a pillar around the governance of transition and system innovation led by John Grin, political scientist from the University of Amsterdam. And, as you could see, it was already quite a massive network involving 10 universities. But in terms of output, it was also, it was really, really substantial. Created 37 PhD theses, 6 special issues, and journals, very many publications. And also through this KSI network, the journal Environmental Innovation and Societal Transitions was established, as well as the Routledge series on sustainability transitions. And also this network set up the first International Sustainability Transition Conference in Amsterdam and paved the way for the STRN Research Network. So you could ask yourself, of course, if we wouldn't have had this KSI network, would we be having this course? And, you know, we, in that sense, pay a lot of intellectual tribute, I think, to the early days of transition research back in the Netherlands. But I think also, just to illustrate path dependency, that the way that the network was set up and the people that were involved in the research that was being done in the early days also very strongly shaped the agenda and the activities and sort of the dynamics, and even sort of, you know, the way the community behaves at present. And nowadays, it's safe to say that it's become a highly internationalized community, as this PhD course already illustrates. But also already in those early days, KSI really not just wanted to do research on sustainability transitions, but really also wanted to foster sustainability transitions in practice and in policy. And it set up sort of, again, three structures to do that. One fundamental research program, one which is more doing applied research, and then also setting up concrete testing grounds, if you like. We nowadays call them living labs. That term didn't exist back in those days, which was really about, you know, running experiments on the ground, doing counterfactual research, asking the what-if question. What if we introduce driverless vehicles in a city, and running sort of experiments through that. It tried to institutionalize its diffusion and co-production of knowledge through competence centers, and that was something where the center I was working, TNO, was heavily preoccupied with, and also had a direct link to various policy initiatives. At that time, the energietransitie, the Dutch energy policy transition, was the key sort of policy domain to which the KSI research tried to engage. And even though there was a lot of enthusiasm and a lot of fruitful discussions across policy, research, and practice, the verdict is that it led to mixed results. It did indeed shape a new discourse, a new framework, new orientation, also in policy making. But others have been critical of the actual impact of transitions research on sort of regular energy policy. For example, a paper by Kernan Smith from 2008, which argues that the transition debate has been overly optimistic about the role of governments, while neglecting the realities of policy formulation and implementation, which is essentially a political process, not a managerial task. And I think this is, a very interesting observation, which has sort of a wider resonance with others that have been criticizing transitions research for taking way too much of a managerial perspective on change and governance, like the paper by Chauvin Walker from 2008, which has a similar sort of quite fundamental critique in it. Let's see. And what also happened with the Dutch energy policy transition was that it basically faded out. There was a change of national government and towards the right, and they've basically they put that policy on the shelf. But having said that, you could say that the glass is half full, the glass is half empty. If you take the glass is half full perspective, you could see that still in other areas, cities, regions, and industries, sort of transition thinking and practice was being picked up and diffused and reproduced. And you could say also sort of the scientific legacy of KSI was that it really sort of laid a foundation for a lot of the work that we are now reading and thinking about and using. The multi-level perspective, strategic niche management, transition management approach, but also some others, maybe less well-known approaches within transition studies related to practice theory, or more sort of explicit political theory like reflexive modernization, the work that John Gwynn's done in that. And of course, technological innovation system approach. Right. Again, if there's any quick questions for clarification. No? Okay. All right. Then that brings me to the final bit of the lecture, and that's a bit of a reflection on where we stand with transition studies. And this is very personal. I'm not claiming that this is a that everybody would agree with me on this. But I just wanted to, given also that this course is part of sort of innovation studies, not necessarily only transition studies, thought it's useful to think about, what are the commonalities between transition theory and innovation studies, and particularly, I guess, innovation system studies. And well, there you go. The first commonality is, of course, that it very much just takes a systemic approach. It looks at elements of a system, actors, technologies, institutions, and their interconnectedness. And in that sense, it's sort of both transition studies and innovation studies sort of they don't subscribe to reducing research on transitions or innovation to sort of singular explanations, but it's always complex in the sense that you don't have simple cause-effect relationships, but there's a lot of interrelations in explaining the dynamics of innovation and transition. Then, what are then the key elements in the system? You could say it refers to capabilities of actors, competences, skills, technologies, etc., knowledge, institutions, rules of the game, be it formal, informal, hard or soft, and all this sort of tied together through networks. Then, both innovation studies and transition studies owe their legitimacy to a large extent to being heavily policy relevant. Also, innovation studies sort of found its origin at a time when Europe was facing economic crisis, and neoclassical economics could not really provide a lot of help. And again, the innovation systems approach became very popular because it provided a new, fresh, and more compelling perspective on how to foster economic development and growth. And similarly, sustainability transitions research and theory is a child of its time, in the sense that it would not have been as important scientifically if we would not have been dealing with all these important sustainability challenges and problems in the past decades. Sustainability science and sustainability studies is obviously a much broader field, and especially through my years in Melbourne, it was for me a bit of an eye-opener also how sustainability transitions research really sort of fits quite a lot in a tradition of technological optimism or ecological modernization, that through innovation, through creativity, we, humankind, are able to basically continue with our socio-economic development, but at the same time address our environmental problems, right? So in that sense, a lot of the sustainability transitions work and theory is not that far away from like green growth. And again, that is something, and I saw that in the questions also, that is something that can be contested. and maybe that technological optimism is overshot. And at the same time, it provides a hopeful theory that we're not screwed completely, but because of human ingenuity, and if we can mobilize political will, there is a way out of the ecological crisis. So that's maybe something more for a conversation over a beer. I'm not, I became maybe personally more critical and skeptical over the years, but I do like to sort of stick to that sort of technological optimism that I find in sustainability transitions. As I find that a lot of other theories in sustainability science don't really provide any compelling theories of change. There's a lot of sort of moralizing and a lot of sort of ideal types of how a sustainable future should look like. And there are good reasons, again, scientifically, ecologically, socially, for what's wrong with our current systems and how indeed future systems should look like. But again, they really struggle to provide guidelines, but also analytical tools, how that change process will unfold and how it could be further supported. Now, scope for convergence between innovation studies and transition studies, I would say yes, especially in the past 4 years, we've increasingly seen challenge-driven innovation policy, mission-oriented innovation policy, through the work of Mariana Mazzucato, transformative innovation policy, the work of Johan Schot, becoming not just influential in academic terms, but also very much in policy terms. And especially, of course, the work of Mariana Mazzucato is currently in finding a lot of purchase with EU policymakers and a lot of influential and powerful policymakers in different countries. And in that sense, there's a very good opportunity, I guess, for transition research to inform that debate. And a lot of, like the transformative innovation policy approach is very much explicitly informed by transition thinking. You could say that is also part of could call it normative turn in innovation studies and policy, where up till, say, 5 years ago, innovation policy was primarily dominated by innovation system thinking, and where the rationale for innovation was tied quite explicitly to ideas of economic growth, economic progress, development, and less so concerned with issues of environmental sustainability, to some extent with sort of social cohesion, but that was mainly within the regional parts of innovation systems literature. But nowadays we see that, Mariana Mazzucato writes, for example, we've been way too preoccupied with the rate of innovation, thinking insufficiently about the direction of innovation. So, and I think that is something that, again, opens up for convergence between transition studies, innovation studies. And also a third interesting aspect, I think, happening with innovation studies is that it's becoming increasingly reflexive, thinking about what are also the dark sides of innovation. And actually, one of the next courses in NORSI will be specifically devoted to the dark side of innovation, which will be held at TIC in Oslo. And one of the presenters there will be Elisa Giuliani, and I found a recent review paper that she did in Industry and Innovation quite helpful to illustrate what's happening in the debate about the dark side of innovation. So one aspect of this relates to the work-related consequences of technology acceptance, and this is sort of what we're experiencing right now. How because of technology innovation, the way we work is becoming increasingly embedded in specific technologies, and also is creating risks and challenges, drawbacks, negative consequences when it comes to privacy, and that's one thing, but also how these of the technology-based working is linked to increased stress. Then there's also within the transitions literature increased appreciation and understanding and acknowledgement of the unsustainable aspects of sustainable transitions. And I think the example there is e-mobility, how, everybody, the diffusion of electric vehicles is on the one hand a good thing for carbon emissions, but on the other hand it creates a lot of issues with resource scarcity, but also the toxicity of batteries that go into electric vehicles. Then thirdly, and that is maybe something that only recently got on the, relatively recently on the map of transitions research, is how sort of innovation and innovation-fueled economies, you could say actually by necessity also lead to polarization and growing inequality, as sort of innovation typically gets concentrated, spatially, in large metropolitan areas, and also, if you like, favors maybe the pros of innovation favor certain social groups more than others, the entrepreneurs, and perhaps less the workers. So we increasingly see that innovation studies is concerned with the downside of an innovation-based economy in terms of growing inequality and polarization. And there's an interesting connection there to the rising work on just transitions in this field. And then I already mentioned the unintended consequences of transition, but you could also think about the unforeseen consequences of transitions. Going to the work of Ulrich Beck and the Risk Society, how there might be aspects of socio-technical transitions that we are not even able to foresee and that have important negative consequences. So to start concluding things, this is just a slide to sort of reflect a bit on how a sustainability transition sort of reconsidered innovation. And I think one of the main forces of transitions research is how it really kind of created a metaphor of David versus Goliath. How small innovations, we call them the hopeful monstrosities, can in fact lead to large-scale systemic transformation. And in that sense, it provides an innovation of hope in the face of rather depressing sustainability challenges. And it also has, as I already said a few times, pointed much more to the role of resistance against innovation. It debunked the idea that all innovation is good, innovationism, and shows that a lot of innovation may be happening within, say, the fossil fuel sector is not good for climate change. It has shown, again, that, all this sort of degenerative stuff that we read about in innovation studies, our entrepreneurship, ideation, novelty creation, R&D, it's very necessary to deal with sustainability challenges, but it's not sufficient. And I think there the TIS framework is really, really sort of made a massive contribution by showing that it is not just about knowledge development and diffusion, but the other functions of the technological innovation system really pointed to other important activities that we need to also be in place. It opened up for not just seeing firms and entrepreneurs as innovators, and what some, including myself, started to call capacious forms of innovation, opening up to looking at social innovation, grassroots innovation. Here the work of Jill Safing and Adrian Smith is of course also important to mention. And as I already mentioned earlier, really seeing innovation not just as a exploration or an exploitation of knowledge process, but really for adding reflexivity to the learning process of innovation. Understanding that innovations are contested politically, and we increasingly see that innovation is understood as experimentation, asking what-if questions, right? I'll come back to that actually way more in our third day. Now, some final challenges and tensions again, with the caveat that this is entirely personal and many people might disagree with this. So the first one is a hegemony of foundational concepts and constraint, a hegemony of foundational concepts. So the new STRN agenda starts with the usual suspects, MLP, SNM, TM, TIS, and you could say that creates path dependency. And some say that's a good thing because we don't have to reinvent the wheel and we need to sort of understand all the progress we've made. But it also, again, applying MLP on itself, it also leads to constraints, and it might lead to challenges in terms of radical theorization of sustainability transitions. This is, for example, also something that a small commentary of Hopkins and colleagues from 2020 has alluded to. So not just sort of building on theories of sustainability transitions, but thinking sustainability transitions differently, not making any use of the usual suspects, might be a refreshing and needed way of engaging with sustainability transitions. In many ways, it's good that sustainability transitions have become institutionalized through conferences and journals, and it is a really lovely and dynamic community. And I'm personally very much looking forward to going to the conference in Vienna later this year. But it also may have kind of created a risk for transitionism, sort of getting a little bit sort of in an own bubble of thinking we as transitionists. And that might also, lead to trade-offs in terms of insufficient sort of reflection and critical thinking. And potentially sort of, the risk that transition research does not sort of engage sufficiently with outsider views because they don't fit in. And I would say at the same time, that's maybe something that this community field does not cannot sort of allow itself to do, because its sort of methodological basis, for example, is quite narrow. I don't know, 9 out of 10 studies on sustainability transitions tend to be case studies. And again, is that methodological nomism? Is that really sound? Another aspect is the policy co-optation. Yes, there is sort of an inherent desire and ambition in transition research to not just sort of study, but also make an impact. But when you do that, you have to also, play with policymakers, and may even have to play with the politicians. And then maybe the way that sort of, you theoretically thought about your policy implications suddenly get a kind of different dynamic. And again, at the same time, sustainability transitions research does not like to just stand on the sides and sort of, make critical comments about how every decision maker and policy maker is doing the wrong thing. So it is really getting its hands dirty, but it also sort of, maybe opens up for risks that transitions research becomes part of a neoliberal discourse. Then something that I personally have been engaged with, of course, is that a lot of the theories of transitions research were initially kind of spaceless, aspatial. I think we've made some progress there, but you could still see that maybe a lot of the foundational work of sustainability transitions does not necessarily allow for easy application beyond its initial spatial context, being developed primarily in sort of Western European economies and societal sort of models. And the difficulty to, so to say, translate concepts from transitions research to other spatial contexts. And then last but not least, something that people also have been criticizing is that transitions research has very much evolved, has been dynamic in the sense that it has responded to criticisms, but one could say in doing so also created a risk of being kind of conceptually plastic, in the sense that it started to stretch itself quite far and maybe trying to be too all-encompassing and trying to basically too much engage with all the critiques and criticisms, and in that sense maybe even becoming a bit of a contradiction in itself. One of the examples I mentioned earlier today was about how do you define a regime, and how that definition and understanding initially was around the institutions, but now it's about also the actors, and similarly there's a discussion about is there agency in the multi-level perspective, and again in dealing with those criticisms, you could say that maybe also the conceptual sort of stretch of the models and of the frameworks has maybe gone a bit too far. All right, I just wanted to conclude with this picture, which I think is very telling about why this is also a very exciting field. Because on the one hand, sort of, this is a field that forefronts innovation and gets a lot of people excited that we are able to address sustainability challenges. But increasingly also it is leading to resistance. When you start talking about transformations and transitions, then you get much more people saying, no, we don't want that. So I think that's sort of an interesting moment in time where we are right now. And yeah, I'll leave it at that. Now we're going to also stop the recording so that we can take questions and so on.